Let's do the ladder stitch. This stitch is many times used to close a pillow or like the opening of a stuffed animal or project. It basically mimics the machine stitch of a plain seam, but it's hand done, so you can get in some places that maybe the machine can't, and it is pretty sturdy and it's secure. So I have my arm's length of thread ready to go here, and I have my needle is about the thickness of 2 thicknesses of thread, because when it folds through my eye, it's going to be about 2 thicknesses that is going to be going through the fabric. So I'm going, and I also have a sharp needle, not an embroidery needle. Basically, that just means it has a round eye or an oval eye, and that just helps so that the thread doesn't tangle as much when you're working. So I'm going to thread the needle, and if you kind of pull your tails even-ish, and then you put your tails on the top of your needle towards the eye, hold them there, and then you wrap it about 3 or 4 times, and then you slide that part under your fingers, and then you pull all of those, the tail and the wrapped part, through your pinched fingers, and you should have a knot at the end. Keep in mind, I am using thicker thread than most people would use for this project. You would realistically use just your typical all-purpose thread for this project, but I have a bigger needle and thicker thread so that maybe it shows up better on camera. So this is my opening that I've left to turn my project, and here is my machine stitched seam on one end of the opening and machine stitched seam on the other end. So we are going to start. I like to start on the right side just because I'm right-handed and I tend to work to the left. So if you are left-handed, you might want to do the opposite of what I'm doing. The direction doesn't really matter though. So I like to start, I kind of turn my work like this, and I start by going behind some of these machine stitches with my needle, and I come out like right next to one of the stitches with the tip of my needle, and then I just kind of let my knot, it hides inside there next to the machine stitches. So you kind of end up overlapping the machine stitches for a little bit. Okay, so since I took my needle out on the left side of the seam allowance, I'm actually going to put my needle in on the right side, directly across from where this one comes out. So if this thread is coming out here, I'm going to just go directly across and put my thread in this other side. Now, when we're taking bites in the fabric, we're not actually taking bites in both layers of the fabric like this. We're actually traveling in the fold. So there's like a little tunnel that the fold makes that we're traveling inside of. So if you look inside of my fold here, my needle is actually taking a stitch across inside the fold in that crease, and it's not on either side of the seam allowance or on the outside of my project. So it's just traveling in this upside down V that the crease of my fold makes. So I'm just going to work across. You want fairly short stitches because you're trying to mimic the length and stitch distance apart that the sewing machine created. So where this stitch comes out on the bottom fold here, I'm going to go directly across, and that's where I'm going to go in on the top fold. And again, you're not able to see the needle on either side of the work or the seam allowance. You just see it in the peak of that crease. And you're traveling sideways. And you want to pull your thread tight enough that basically you can't see your stitches. But if you pull too tightly, you'll get kind of this S shape with your fabric, and your seam will be curvy looking and wrinkled looking and not smooth like the rest of the machine stitching is. So that's kind of how you know you've pulled it too tight, if you're changing the shape of your seam. Okay, so this one is out on the top fold. Here's my knot underneath there. So I'm actually just reaching the point where I'm done with the machine stitches. I'm no longer overlapping those. And now the rest on, these are all hand stitched for this opening. Some people do like to pin this opening closed. So this is what that would look like if you prefer to close it with pins before you work. You would just kind of go this direction with your pins and do that with the whole opening. I don't love that because for me, the pin heads kind of get in my way, and sometimes I stab myself with a pin when I'm holding the work. So I just actually I always just keep making sure that I'm holding it smoothly and I'm not, holding it too long or too short on one side or the other. You want to just maintain that tension across with the fold so that they stay stacked on top of each other smoothly. So we're out on this end of the top fold. So now I'm going to go straight across, just like the rungs of a ladder, which is where it gets its name, I'm thinking. And then you go inside that fold. And then sometimes you have to sneak it over the corner, no big deal. So if you see my work, I've got a little bit more, like one side of my thread is a little bit longer than the other. So you just kind of run your fingernail down your thread and that evens out. Now you can see my stitches a little bit because again, I'm using such thick thread and I'm also using a thread that's contrasting to my fabric, but ideally you would use the same color thread as your fabric, and then these stitches would just disappear in the fabric. They would be almost invisible. So like the rungs on a ladder, so pretend like we're going straight across with our thread. I'm going to go straight across with my needle, and that's where I'm going to travel inside the peak of the fold there. So you can see here, if I pull it too tight, that's kind of what my seam does. So that's a reminder that you pulled it too tight. If you have something that looks like this, you didn't pull tight enough because the folds are not together. So you want to pull just tight enough that it's smooth. Okay, so I'm out on this side on the top fold, so I'm going to go directly across with my tip of my needle and go in and across this fold. And you just do that all the way across your opening. So once I do that all the way across, so the temptation to do like a little bit in this side and then a little bit over here without pulling your stitch smooth, it actually isn't as nice of a seam when you're done. So you really want to avoid that temptation, resist that, and just do one stitch at a time. So if you do pull your seam too tight, you can sort of just give it a little tug and smooth it out, and it'll sort of go back to what it needs to be. So I'm gonna go all the way across with this. Got another bubble, so I'm going to just pull and then smooth it all the way down to the eye so that it evens out through the fold of your thread. You're just traveling inside the fold. You're not on either side of your fabric. It would be slightly easier for you if you are using thinner thread, but like I said, I'm using this thicker thread so that it shows up maybe a little bit better on camera. This is also a good stitch. Say you're wearing something and you notice that you've got a hole in the seam, maybe of your pant leg or something, or a skirt, whatever, something you're wearing, or maybe your backpack has a hole in the side seam, you can just quickly mend it with the ladder stitch, and it is almost invisible. So even if you don't have the exact same color thread with you, you can still get a secure mend, and you don't have to worry about it coming out later. It's just a neatly done stitch. It's not messy looking on either side when it's complete, and it's a very secure stitch. So it's a really good all-purpose, stitch. I prefer this one also for, like, if you make a pillow or like a pot holder, something that you would need to sew it shut. I prefer this stitch as opposed to a small whip stitch. I just think that this one's more invisible and just as secure as a lot of other structural stitches. It actually doesn't take this long once you kind of get a rhythm down. I'm kind of struggling with this thick thread today though. But if I were using regular thread, you could even run a little bit of beeswax or thread magic on your thread, and that sort of cuts down drag. When you're dragging your thread through the fabric, it kind of cuts down the friction on the thread and it glides much faster. If you don't have either one of those two things, and maybe your thread is tangling a lot, or it sort of feels like it takes more effort to drag it through the fabric than you would like it to, you can also sort of run a fabric softener sheet. Just kind of go like this a couple times on your thread with a fabric softener sheet, and that kind of helps a lot too. So a couple of things that you can do to make it a little easier and faster, so that you can move on to another project. You can even do something like mend a baby blanket, maybe somebody's quilt. If you use a small enough ladder stitch, you could even mend like 2 squares of a quilt together. Maybe the seam in between the 2 colors is coming apart, and you don't want to take apart the entire quilt just to fix that seam on your machine. You can just ladder stitch it, small stitches, matching thread, and you won't have to notice that seam that you repaired it with, but it puts a lot more life in quilts. Sometimes you'll get that special blanket that is made and you really can't take it all the way apart just to fix, a 1-inch separation in a seam. So you can just carefully ladder stitch it, and it's invisible and just as secure as it was before. So that's another way I've used the ladder stitch in the past. It's also a way to emergency fix. Maybe you need to take in your dress or your top before an event. Maybe it's not fitting properly like it should and you need to take in the side quickly. You could just ladder stitch a new seam and it would be smaller. So, okay, I'm almost to the end here, where I'm going to sort of finish ladder stitching because I'm meeting the machine stitches. So I'll show you what that looks like. So as we get to the end, we're actually going to overlap and work in this fold for a few more stitches, and we're going to kind of overlap the machine stitches just so that there's a smooth transition, and it's actually an invisible transition if you just overlap those machine stitches. That way you don't have a gap in the seam and there's a hole there just because you didn't stop, far enough back. So it's better to overlap than it is to leave a gap. So I'm almost there. Got about 1/2 inch left. Still traveling in the fold. Okay, here's my machine stitch, my first one. And so when I did machine stitching, I did reverse and go. So both of these stitches, machine stitched, are reversed and knotted basically with the machine before I finished that. So they're not just a stitch that ends. Those are secured with a reverse stitch too. So they shouldn't come out either. Okay, directly across from there. And now my needle, I'm actually going to go right here next to the machine stitching on this side. And directly across, I'm going to go basically where the machine stitches are. So I'm going to go in here next to them. Then I'm going to kind of wiggle my needle through and overlap those machine stitches. Do that one more time, I think. One more. And then I'm going to show you how to tie it off. So right here in this fold, got a bubble in my thread. Okay. Okay, so how you tie it is you go to the stitch that's just next to the stitch you were at. So here is a machine stitch right here. You can see that. I'm going to put my needle under that stitch and kind of grab onto it. You might get a little bit of fabric, that's okay. And that's going to anchor my knot. So when I put my needle in that stitch, that previous stitch, I'm going to hold this loop that I'm making. Okay, so it's going to close most of the way, but I'm going to keep my finger in it. And then I'm going to put my needle into the loop that I'm holding, and I'm going to hold this new loop now that I'm making and let this first loop close. So you just kind of pull this part of the second loop, and then the first loop will close. And then you hold this loop, and you put your needle into that loop, and you don't have to hold this one now. And you just pull that, give it a couple quick tugs, and that's your knot. So instead of just cutting your tail close to that knot, the tail, like if you cut it here, the tail actually could unknot eventually with using this product or washing it. That tail can come out of the knot and the knot would come undone. So what you want to do is right next to your knot now, so right next to your knot, you are going to put your needle into the fabric right next to it. Kind of wiggle it between the two layers of fabric, between the seam allowances. Whoops. You want it to go inside those layers. You don't want to be able to see your needle on either side of your fabric. Just put it in about at least that far. And then you can let your needle come out someplace. It doesn't matter where. So you're going to pull your needle through now and make sure this isn't tangled. Pull your needle through. And if it's smaller thread, it won't show a big knot like mine does. And it'll just be it'll look like a stitch there. And if you pull your thread just a little bit tight and kind of buckle your fabric there, kind of kink it, and then if you clip it next to the thread or next to the fabric, and then you just pull that smooth, and then your tail is inside between all the layers and it's hidden. And since it's a little bit longer of a tail, it's more secure than if you were just to cut it right next to the knot. So that is what the ladder stitch looks like. I would press it, of course. And if you look, pull both of these layers apart. If this was a pillow, for example, you really wouldn't see the stitches, especially if I used matching thread. So that's what the ladder stitch should look like if you've done it well.